Wow. Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you so much to our distinguished co-chairs who brought us all together today. I must say this was a very inspiring day. This is going down memory lane in many ways for many of us, but at the same time, it's the kind of stuff that history is made of and that we tend to forget because there are just too many stories, individual reminiscences that we all have, and we forget those details. So this has been, for me at least personally, a glorious day, and I'd like to thank you all for having me over here. One thing that you did not mention, which I actually find very important in my own career, if you want to call it that, is I took a step out quite consciously halfway after about 5-6 years of my UNHCR career, and I studied again for one, but for two I worked for an NGO, and an important one at that. I worked for Amnesty for 5 years, and I wrote all the reports on some of those countries from where the refugees originated, including Vietnam. So I think I have seen both sides of that coin. And what really touched me incredibly is what we heard today from our Vietnamese refugee who spoke about his experience in re-education, because that's what I studied. That's what I researched for many years, with the aim that you could ultimately blindfold me if and when I would ever be given the chance to visit one of those places, and I did visit some of those places. And I can tell you, you walk out with a huge lump in your throat afterwards and don't know what to make out of what you have just seen. Distinguished co-chairs, participants, guests, ladies and gentlemen, and I dare say, dear friends. It is really, and I don't say that lightly, a privilege and an honor for me to join you and to have been invited for this conference organized by the Canadian Immigration Historical Society and the Center for Refugee Studies, which I have not visited for the first time, which also marks the 25th anniversary of the center, and I'm conscious of that too. It is particularly a pleasure to do so in the presence of the founder, the towering Howard Edelman, whom I've met previously also, and who, among many other things, is also inter alia known as the chief architect of the Canadian response to the Indo-Chinese crisis, and of course its present director, whom unfortunately has to, or is at home tonight, but I was very happy to see her today in the course of the day, Jennifer Heitman. And of course I would very much like to salute the efforts of Michael Malloy and James Simeon for doing all the work that made this conference possible. Canada has always been a strong supporter. I think you noticed that from my intervention, which was not just to please the participants in the audience, but I really believe what I said, otherwise I wouldn't have done so. But it has been a strong supporter of UNHCR through thick and thin, and the refugee cause as exemplified by its consistent intake of refugees under its resettlement policy already dating back to World War II, and particularly so since '76, and the partnership between the government and the private sponsorship groups that have become a pillar of Canada's resettlement program ever since. The combination, or this combination, resulted in the extraordinary and, I believe, unique response by the Canadian people to the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis that enabled more than 60,000 refugees to start a new life in Canada within the span of a couple of years between the late 70s and early 80s. This generous commitment and the continued support beyond the Indo-Chinese crisis was recognized in 1986 in what we have seen earlier, when the people of Canada were awarded the Nansen Medal for their truly exceptional contribution to the refugee cause. and I salute you all for having played your part in that. My own journey with UNHCR and in assisting Vietnamese boat people as they became known started, I hasten to say, some 35 years ago. As somebody earlier today said, there's a lot of gray hair in the room. I was doing at the time my alternative military service. Of course I had to become a conscientious objector in Germany. What else would you become when that decision was looming? And I decided to do it in Malaysia, where I came across my first boat of newly arrived Vietnamese on the shores of Tanjung Aru, just outside of Kota Kinabalu, the capital of the East Malaysian state of Sabah, which at least David, I understand, has visited during his days in the region. It was there and then that I resolved, if ever given the opportunity, that I would like to contribute to alleviate the suffering of refugees and help them regain their dignity if I could. I had learned Malay during my 2 years in Malaysia, and the mix of experience and language skills perhaps proved of interest to UNHCR, and before I knew it, I found myself walking along the shores of Lac Léman in Geneva, Switzerland, for my first day of work with UNHCR in October '79, wondering what was in store for me. Barely a week later, I had my first formal interview with a newly arrived boat on the Indonesian island of Pulau Bintan, just south of Singapore. A group of exhausted but happy Vietnamese were huddled in the shade of a coconut plantation, awaiting help from the local authorities and UNHCR. We established the boat's history, took down the names and the basic biodata of each of the passengers, checked for any untoward incidents en route, looked for people with special needs, and announced that they would forthwith be transferred to a refugee camp on the island. This is incidentally exactly what we still do today. On the shores of Yemen, Lampedusa, Malta, some things don't seem to change. We did it in those days on blue cards, as we call them, little registration cards. Nowadays we do it through iris recognition directly into our laptop through the help of Microsoft and others. What is this? Before departing that day, after the interviews, one of the refugees asked to have a private conversation with me out of sight of the rest of the camp. We sat down in the back of the UNHCR Jeep, which offered the only privacy available. The individual then told me that he was a Catholic priest and that his bishop had given him a handgun for his and his co-passengers' protection if need be. And he was happy to now pass that gun on to me, since he was now under UNHCR's protection. Off the gun went into the glove compartment of the vehicle, ending up for months in the UNHCR safe in Tanjung Pinang in the office. It was eventually disposed of rather unceremoniously, I must say, for a good reason. I had learned from my stay in Malaysia and Singapore that possession of a firearm carried a mandatory death penalty if caught by the authorities, and this also applied in Indonesia. Within days, I was on a Conoco helicopter, an oil company that had a presence in the region, and this is what UNHCR chartered. En route to what is known as the Anambas Islands. In that slide that you saw from David today, there was all these Malaysian East Coast camps, and then there was that group of islands to the very far right. This is where I was dropped from a helicopter and say, go ahead, do what needs to be done. I was on that flight the initial one, where over the preceding months some 50,000 Vietnamese had arrived in their rickety boats, guided by a lighthouse on Pulau Jemaja, as it is known. 2 camps had grown into sizable towns of plastic sheeting and bamboo structures held together by coconut trees, which were called Ayaraya and Kuku camps. Many of you probably know it and have been there. After a couple of hours flying over seemingly endless open seas beneath us, the pilot announced that no radio beacon on Pulau Jemaja, with no radio beacon on the island, to guide his flight, we had probably missed the island and were now closer to Saigon than Singapore. We only had a few minutes fuel left if we turned around immediately, he announced, and that's precisely what he did. So after 3.5 hours of flying one way over the South China Sea, we turned around and did exactly the same thing again, eventually making an emergency landing on a sandy beach near Singapore, from where the pilot managed to radio for support and get us all back to base. So much for my first baptism in UNHCR. And it turned out to be just the beginning of an itinerant life throughout Southeast Asia, the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, as you've heard, and eventually to New York, where I'm now representing the office. As a recently retired colleague said in his farewell speech to our executive committee in October, likening his UNHCR career to 2 Beatles songs that you all know, it at times felt like a long and winding road, but overall, it is one big magical mystery tour. Let me turn to the subject on which you've asked me to speak. I will begin by providing a little context of the Indo-Chinese crisis as it unfolded, and we have heard many references already today to that, so please forgive me if I repeat some of the things that have already been said. The crucial years were obviously the 20 years between 75 and 1995, 96. During this period, some 3 million individuals from the 3 former French colonies of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia sought asylum in neighboring countries. Countless others died tragically on their journeys. More than 2 million were eventually resettled in 3rd countries, and the remainder returned to their countries of origin. To place this into perspective, when the first refugees fled in 1975, UNHCR's total annual expenditure stood at less than $80 million worldwide. By 1980, this had increased to over 500 million. By way of comparison, UNHCR will probably spend this year alone in excess of $850 million on the Syria crisis alone, with expenditures globally probably reaching in excess of $2.5 billion. In the final days before the fall of Saigon in April '75, some 140,000 Vietnamese who were closely associated with the former regime were evacuated from the country and resettled mostly in the US. The figure has been referred to earlier today already. This, in turn, was followed by a smaller exodus of Vietnamese who made their way by boat to neighboring Southeast Asian shores. By the end of '75, some 12,000 Vietnamese had arrived, chiefly in Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, and not a single country in that region had at the time acceded to the 51 Refugee Convention or the 67 Protocol. This was terra incognita. This exodus was then exacerbated in the following years through domestic changes in Vietnam, nationalization strategies, increasingly hostile policies towards the ethnic Chinese population, together with the deterioration of the relations with China and the internment of 1 million people in so-called re-education camps, of which we heard earlier today. By the end of '78, nearly 62,000 Vietnamese boat people resided already in camps throughout the region. Although, to be more precise, the majority were ethnic Chinese from the Mekong Delta and the sprawling market of Chulan outside of Saigon. Many of you remember the images, and we saw some today, in November '78 of the Hai Hong, or the Tung An, which was another boat stranded outside of Manila. It was a 1,500-ton freighter in Malaysian waters seeking to offload the approximately 2,500 Vietnamese it carried aboard. And by the end of '79, an additional 250,000 people from Vietnam had taken refuge in China by land. We forget that very often, but that was another movement out of the country. When boat arrivals escalated dramatically with more than 54,000, also a reference made today already, across Southeast Asia in June '79 alone, the pushbacks started in earnest, and they became routine. I interviewed many single survivors of boats who simply survived by clinging onto a jerry can until they were rescued by a fisherman, which is like searching for the needle in the haystack. Many of you also remember the extraordinary generosity that came with the single appeal to launch rescue boats in the region. At one stage we had 5 of those boats cruising around the South China Sea, trying to, what? Drive between pirates and refugee boats, rescue people at sea, despite the numerous calls of distress that we have heard of today also, of commercial ships bypassing people in total distress, and nobody heard their cries. Nobody wanted to take them on board for fear of getting stuck with their burden and not being able to offload them. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese likely perished at sea as a result. Barry Wayne, who I consider a friend, who was at the time with the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong, published a book in '81 called The Refused. And he estimated that perhaps as many as 10% of all the boat people in those days may have drowned, or were attacked, or raped, or killed by pirates, or died of dehydration. Taken together, I think refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia residing in the camps throughout the region amounted probably to some 350,000 people at the time in the summer of 1979. An additional 500,000 Khmer could be found straddling the Thai-Cambodian border, not counted as refugees, not allowed into Thai territory, kept at bay by a conscious policy of keeping them out of the kingdom. Since the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia at the end of '78, some 140,000 refugees had entered Thailand, but in June '79 the government responded with a massive refoulement, as we call that in international refugee law, of some 40,000 Khmer back to Cambodia in the area around the contested ancient temples of Preah. Against the backdrop of the Cold War-inspired suspicions of refugees representing a potential fifth column, and given that many governments in the region were themselves still engaged in counter-insurgency operations, the international refugee protection system had reached breaking point. Madame Sadako Ogata, then the UNHCR High Commissioner, recalled later that rarely before had the institution of asylum come under such a direct threat. As a consequence of this untenable situation, 65 governments attended an international conference on Indo-Chinese refugees in July '79 in Geneva. Several international commitments were made at the conference, including the doubling of resettlement places from 125,000 to 260,000. Vietnam agreed to declare a moratorium on illegal departures and to promote instead a program of orderly departures from Vietnam. Indonesia and the Philippines pledged to establish regional so-called processing centers to speed up resettlement and to ease the pressure on countries of first asylum in the region. Promises of new financial support to UNHCR were also made, totaling some $160 million. That represented more than a doubling of the total budget contributions for the previous 4 years. Although no formal commitments were made regarding asylum, the meeting endorsed the general principles of asylum and non-refoulement. Countries of first asylum clearly expected that no refugees would stay in their countries longer than necessary, and thus a quid pro quo was formalized. Temporary or first asylum in the region combined with permanent resettlement elsewhere. With that understanding in place, the main objective of the conference had been achieved. The pushbacks of boats seeking to arrive on the shores of neighboring countries were largely halted. Regional arrival rates fell dramatically also, as Vietnam placed heavy penalties on clandestine departures, and a trickle of direct departures began from Vietnam through the orderly departure program. As a result of the '79 conference, the most immediate crisis was thus resolved in what amounted to the first tripartite agreement made between a country of origin, a country of first asylum, and countries of resettlement. The ASEAN countries promised to uphold their commitments to provide temporary asylum as long as Vietnam undertook to prevent irregular departures, to promote orderly departures instead, and as long as third countries accelerated the rate of resettlement. International resettlement, which had been taking place at the rate of about 9,000 people per month in the first half of 1979, increased to approximately 25,000 per month in the latter half of that same year. That's the scale we are talking about. Unprecedented and probably never taken place since. More than 450,000 Indo-Chinese refugees were subsequently resettled from Southeast Asian camps over a period of just 18 months. From 1980 to 1986, resettlement even outpaced the declining rate of arrivals, and there was growing optimism about solving the regional refugee crisis. Although the ODP, as it was known by its acronym, the Orderly Departure Program, started slowly, it gradually gathered momentum too. By 1984, annual departures under that program had risen to about 29,000 people, exceeding the regional boat arrivals of just under 25,000. Originally intended to benefit relatives of Vietnamese refugees already in the US and South Vietnamese who had ties to the US government, the ODP later extended to include the so-called Amerasians, a particular group that has not been mentioned today but that I think need to deserve attention as well, and former political prisoners and re-education camp detainees. Between '79 and '99, more than 500,000 Vietnamese entered the US under this program. As the boat arrivals began to surge again, however, in 1987 to 88, it became apparent that the understanding achieved at that first conference was breaking down. 10 years after the first Indo-Chinese conference, it therefore became necessary in June 89 to hold yet another. On this occasion, yet again, 70 governments participated at the meeting, and again in Geneva. A new regional approach was agreed upon, which became known as the Comprehensive Plan of Action, the CPA. The CPA represented an enormous, perhaps unprecedented, multilateral effort to resolve a refugee problem at a regional level. It was also one of the first where the country of origin became a critical actor, and it would not have been possible 10 years earlier. En bref, the CPA had 5 main objectives. First and foremost, to reduce the clandestine departures through punitive measures against organizers and profiteers of boat departures, and through mass information campaigns in Vietnam of what was in Spey for people who attempted to do so. It was an attempt to stop the dying on the high seas and to stop the profiteering that clearly was going on. It was easier said than done, I can tell you that much. Simultaneously, an effort was made to promote increased opportunities for legal migration under the Orderly Departure Program. Second, to provide temporary asylum to all new arrivals until their status was established and a durable solution was identified. Third, to determine the refugee status of all asylum seekers in accordance with international refugee law in an environment where none of the participating states had signed the 51 Convention. Fourth, to resettle all those recognized as refugees, as well as all Vietnamese who were in camps prior to a certain cut-off date into third countries. And fifth and final, most controversially at the time, to return all those found not to be refugees to their countries of origin. You can imagine the bombshell that that created. How could you possibly go back to the country from where you had just fled? Nevertheless, I think the entire international refugee regime was predicated on the distinction between those who deserved international protection and those who did not. And clearly, a balance between the two had to be found to rescue the consensus that had broken down. The CPA finally brought an end to the flow of Vietnamese asylum seekers. In '89, roughly 70,000 Vietnamese sought asylum in Southeast Asia. 3 years later, in '92, only 41 Vietnamese did so, and the numbers remained negligible thereafter. At the time of the second Indo-Chinese conference, a total of some 50,000 pre-cut-off date Vietnamese were in camps in Southeast Asia. By the end of '91, virtually all of them had been resettled. Of the post-cut-off Vietnamese, a total of 32,000 were recognized as refugees and subsequently resettled, and approximately 83,000 who were deemed not to be refugees in need of international protection were returned home. Overall, during the 8 years of the CPA, more than 500,000 Vietnamese and Laotians were resettled in third countries. In conclusion, the Indo-Chinese refugee exodus over nearly a quarter of a century marked a turning point for all of us, not just UNHCR, everybody. A number of lessons were learned all around, I'm sure. On the positive side, the example of commitment from resettlement countries is and remains unsurpassed and shows what the world can do when it comes together to resolve a problem. It is likewise instructive that Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam eventually all accepted repatriation and reintegration programs. Innovative responses were also evident in the orderly departure program, in particular, and the anti-piracy and the rescue at sea programs that were launched at the time to save countless lives. Another undoubted achievement of the CPA was the subsequent accession of a number of countries in the region to the 51 Refugee Convention. Cambodia, China, Japan, South Korea, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines all have become parties to the convention. On the downside, far too many people drowned at sea, or otherwise lost their lives or suffered in other ways from pirate attacks, rape, shelling, pushbacks, and long-term detention in inhumane conditions. This is a tragedy that unfortunately repeats itself still today. In the Gulf of Aden, in the Mediterranean, and elsewhere. Our failure collectively to put in place a CPA for Somalia, for Syria, and for other refugees suggests we have only learned our lessons of the Indo-Chinese experience partially. We need to harness the energy, the ingenuity, the creativity, and the collaboration all around displayed in the Indo-Chinese refugee program into a protection and solution-oriented framework for the millions of refugees today. Just think, in the space of just the last 2 years, we have witnessed an outpouring of Syrian refugees across Syria's borders at the rate of 5,000 to 7,000 people a day, every day, relentlessly, to reach by now an estimated 3 million people registered and unregistered in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. In both Lebanon and Jordan, Syrians today already constitute more than a quarter of the total population. And yet, there does not seem to be an end in sight to stop the hemorrhaging of Syria. When the High Commissioner Antonio Guterres, now in his 8th year, convened the first high-level segment, as that is referred to, ministerial level international conference of our executive committee just this past September, in the presence of foreign ministers of both Jordan and Lebanon as the key countries in the region, and executive heads of 5 sister UN agencies and the World Bank present, the total number of humanitarian evacuation places pledged at that conference was but a token 10,000, of which Germany had already announced 5,000 well beforehand. Compare the situations in 1979 with today and tell me if this is the kind of burden sharing we really want to see between countries in the region, bearing the brunt of the burden, and those countries further beyond with infinitely greater means to respond. How many more Syrians will have to die beyond the 100,000 already reported? How many more internally displaced will we see beyond the present estimated 6.5 million IDPs? And how many more refugees will have to join the exodus before the regional and international response system is reaching breaking point? What will it take before Canada, together with other states, will respond to the ongoing misery by stepping up to the plate with the same generosity displayed in the Indo-Chinese context and say, enough? Before finishing, I would like to pay homage to 2 outstanding individuals without whose extraordinary intellect stamina, wisdom, and foresight, each in his own distinct style. The CPA would never have come about in the way it did, and thereby saving countless lives. Both would still be with us today if they would not have met their own destiny together 10 years ago in that most tragic and devastating bomb attack on the United Nations headquarters in Baghdad, Iraq. And that is Sergio, Vera de Mello, and Arthur Helton, who was then the director, or who was previously the director of the Lawyers' Committee for Human Rights and was a fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations at the time. May their example continue to inspire us all forever. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Janz has agreed to answer a couple of questions, so if anyone is interested in looking into it. I think it was a very comprehensive and inspiring address. I couldn't think of anything better. And you know, when you think we've had such a long, riveting day, you didn't lose a single person, you know. It says something about what you said, sir. So if anyone wishes to address a question or two, please, this is your moment. Yes.
Thank you.
United Nations system and the other international organizations working with human rights and international development. With whom does UNHCR currently find its closest ally working on sort of this kind of a vision? Who are your allies within the system?
There has been a lot of change since those days. There are new organizations that have been created and have matured, some of them non-operational and more interested seemingly in coordination, but it's something that needed to be put in place as well. Our closest allies, without a doubt, in the humanitarian relief effort is first and foremost civil society organizations, NGOs, with whom we have partnered for many, many years. And the percentage of UNHCR's operational budget that goes, in fact, into non-governmental organizations, and increasingly so local non-governmental organizations, has been really increasing at a phenomenal rate over the last 10 years. Within the UN, our main sister organizations are clearly WFP and UNICEF. WFP because we have a memorandum of understanding that in any mass displacement situation, over 5,000 people, we will stop providing food and WFP will come in. They are infinitely better in doing so. They have a whole machinery that drives their logistics, their procurement, their distribution. There's no better partner to do it than WFP. Similarly, in many situations, camp-like situations, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Kakuma and Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world, where you have people born and died in. 3 generations of Somalis live in Dadaab. You have children in refugee camps here. We need UNICEF on board to do exactly what they do in any national context with refugee and displaced populations as well. So they are really the pillars of our joint, if you like, humanitarian intervention where we can. Please don't be shy, unless you are waiting for dessert, which I can also understand. The human rights element is something that I want to perhaps dwell on for a second. Part of my motivation to continue came out of understanding the reasons for flight. Why do people make that decision? It's a risky proposition. inevitably. When I asked people who arrived in Lampedusa or in Malta why on earth they take the risk to cross the Mediterranean, and somebody today, you did, I think, said it's probably in excess of 20,000 people who have drowned in their attempt to cross into Europe. They looked at me in total bewilderment and said, if it is 1 in 5 that has drowned, that's the best lottery in town. Wouldn't you do the same? If you have nothing to look forward to, if there is no employment, no way to generate an income for a family legally, to lead a dignified life, what else do you want me to do? It's not easy to answer that question. I remember many of you, especially those few, thank God, who had to write their life's history down again and again and again in a re-education camp, know what is generally referred to as Ho Chi Minh's testament. Everybody who has ever been to Vietnam has seen it staring at you from the billboards. Không có gì quý hơn độc lập tự do is the notion that nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. What I have seen many times over is that in the popular mind, especially in the camps, Vietnamese have made their own version of that slogan by cutting off the C and the P in Doc Lap so that it reads, perhaps liberally translated, nothing is more precious than freedom from want and freedom from fear. And I think we can all agree with that, no? Thank you.